The stars align themselves before you, reader. And here now at the Glade of Liu, I have to say, you've come so very far.
Never have I seen the lines between gaming genres get so blurred as they do in Supergiant's Pyre. It is a visual novel, arcade, sport, fantasy RPG. It's unique, it's evocative, and it's oh so good. Pyre was released to the world in July of 2017 to the PC and the PS4, and it had quite the pedigree to live up to. Although I haven't played much of Supergiant's other games, Bastion and Transistor, they are both known for a couple of different qualities. Visually striking artwork, unique gameplay styles, and music that integrates into the game and story itself. Pyre has all of these qualities and then some. You play as the reader, which is not a good thing when you live in a world where literacy is banned. You've been banished to the downside, a world that exists underneath society itself. The only way to free yourself from this exile is to take part in the rites, ceremonial games that happen within the universe. These games are 3-on-3 matches. Each team has a goal, and there's a ball that spawns in the center of the arena. You control one character at a time, but can swap between them instantly with the push of a button. Each character projects an aura around themselves that, if the opponent steps in, they die and need to wait a few seconds before respawning. Carrying the ball makes you lose your aura, so going on the offensive to place the ball in the opponent's pyre is when you're at your most vulnerable. This core set of rules is all you need to understand to get you started, but layers get added as you progress through the game. You start out with a few basic character archetypes, the big slow characters, the small fast characters, and your normal speed guys who fall somewhere in between. Later characters that get added to your roster have the ability to summon small companions or fly. Additional depth is also added as your character learns new passive abilities. Upon leveling up, you'll get a talent point that you get to assign. The game never bogs you down in complexity or statistics, but instead gives you meaningful, different trees to pick fun and varied abilities from. There's a lot going on in the rites themselves, and they're far more fun than I originally thought they were going to be. But there is far more to Pyre than just the sport itself. The rites are actively interwound with the narrative. When you're not taking part in the games themselves, you're playing a visual novel with branching paths and decisions, and a damn good visual novel at that. Almost immediately when you start the game, you encounter fellow exiles who soon become your allies. Your band is a team in the games, known as the Nightwings. For the first half of your game, your adventure is in a mostly linear fashion, the stars guiding you ever closer to the Liberation Rite, where your team can fight for the honor of being freed. You'll be given some decisions to make at forks in the road, but you'll always end up in the same place in the end. You'll spend lots of time in your wagon talking to your partners. The narrative is entirely pushed forward by the characters and their motivations. Slowly you will learn more and more about your allies' pasts and why they were cast down here, and sometimes those pasts will have an active effect on the gameplay itself. Rookie Greentail becomes apprehensive when our next fight is scheduled against an old enemy, and requests that he be sit out for a game. On the contrary, Pamitha's sibling rivalry with her sister on the other team makes it so that she actually wants to be a participant in this game. The visual novel aspect of Pyre has an active effect on the rites, and the rites have an active effect on the visual novel. There is no fail state in Pyre. Losing a rite does not prompt you with a retry button, but instead the game continues on, with you being the loser. Your record will adjust accordingly on the roster, and your team may squabble amongst themselves, ashamed of their defeat. A game so heavily relying on visual novel aspects would mean nothing if the writing wasn't solid. On both a micro and macro level, the writing of Pyre delivers. Each of your characters is in-depth and compelling, and the greater narrative that they all funnel into is incredibly well crafted. It feels like you're being placed into a world with its own cultures and histories, and you can learn more about it by reading the controversial tome stored in your wagon. This sacred text unlocks more and more chapters as you progress through the story, which in turn lets you learn more and more about the society that's going on up above, the Commonwealth, and the people who founded it. Though I never saw it with my own eyes, the game gives you more than enough context to make you care about it, whether those feelings are positive or negative.
the Nightwings go, and it is done.
The early game's linearity gets shaken up when you come across a pivotal moment around halfway through. Upon reaching the Liberation Rite, dictated by the brightest star in the sky, it is revealed to you that not your entire team gets to go free if you win, but instead one person can go at a time for each Liberation Rite that you win. It's a powerful change in tone for the game, where once you were a cohesive unit striving towards that singular goal of freedom, now you're forced with choices that can prove divisive amongst your party. It is simultaneously a gameplay and narrative decision who you decide to let go. Sometimes the characters that you have become most fond of and want to see freed are also some of the most core members of any strategies that you built out. And once they're free, only to be heard from again with messages sent back from the other side. After your first Liberation Rite, the wagon upon which you've been traveling this whole time gains the ability to fly, and you gain the ability to pick which stars you want to fight under to prepare yourself for the next Liberation Rite. It's a stark difference in gameplay style, but it isn't the only way in which the game changes as you progress. One of the major additions that happens at this point is the introduction of constellations. Before each rite, you can select which constellations you want to invoke. They are handicaps that you can apply to your team in exchange for greater rewards if you win. You can apply multiple handicaps at a time for an increased reward. It's an incredible system. It doesn't completely replace the traditional difficulty selection. You can still play the game on easy, medium, or hard, but this extra layer of opt-in difficulty is a really great way to make it so that the game is just as hard as you want, but also add another layer of strategic depth. The handicaps you apply are very specific, and knowing which one to use depending on the team you're facing can mitigate their effects. Imposing the constellation that makes it so that all of your opponents resurrect immediately when they simultaneously fall is not too large of a downside when you play a defensively oriented team. If you're really confident in your abilities, feel free to impose every single one on yourself for the greatest possible return for the game. I can't go any further without talking about Pyre's exceptional presentation. The character artwork is beautiful, and each character has a strikingly different silhouette with tons of variety. The landscapes you traverse upon and the arenas you fight on top of each have their own visual theme, and the stained glass style and color palette go well with the game's anti-theocracy themes. But the star of the presentation is the music.
For the salt and roiling sea, the moon began to cry. The valley ran with sorrowful tears and filled the waters high.
The music is brilliantly intertwined into the gameplay and the story. It's not just a movie soundtrack thrown on top of a game, it is a game soundtrack. Each character in your band has their own specific instruments that jump into the piece when they're on screen. The rites themselves will also have a theme based on the opponents that you're facing off against, but different layers are presented to you depending on different in-game triggers, such as whether or not someone possesses the ball. Perhaps most impressively of all is the vocal arrangement at the end of the game that recounts the tales of what transpired specifically on your journey, detailing each of the character endings that you got. Needless to say, I freaking love this game, so if you're looking for a recommendation, then the answer is an absolute yes. But from here on out, I want to talk a little bit more about some story spoilers, some of which occur pretty late in the game, so come back to this section once you've beaten Pyre for yourself. In perhaps an even greater twist than the individual freedom from halfway through the game, it gets revealed that with each liberation rite you perform, the stars grow dimmer and dimmer. The end result is that there are a limited number of liberation rites that you can partake in, and even assuming you win every single one of them, there's not enough to free your entire party. Being forced to leave some of your allies behind is tragic, and the decision on which ones to leave behind weighed very heavily on me. By the time the liberation rites came to a close and the stars faded into the darkness, 3 of my allies were stuck in the downside, as I elected to send myself back to society. The tone of the game is incredibly melancholy. Even when you're playing perfectly and winning every single rite, it's a sad truth to recognize that giving your allies freedom is also robbing your opponents of freedom. Even though I felt like I got a good ending, I was left sad and emotional. In a good way, of course. Your adventure ends with you getting a selection of vignettes to look at, where you can learn a little bit more about what happened to each person that you encountered on the journey and how your decisions impacted them. Everything about Pyre integrates so perfectly. So often I play games where each of its components is a disparate part, where it feels like the story gets written and then the game builds scenarios around that story, and then the artists come in afterwards and spruce it all up with some music. It's clear that that's not the case here. Every aspect of Pyre feels like it was built around a different aspect, and they all come together to move towards a single and unified vision. Pyre is so much more than the sum of its parts, but each part is still really, really good.
Gain the summit of the sacred Mount Aladiel to conduct the liberation rite, even as the stars themselves abandon you. Make good upon these final opportunities, reader. This glorious age-old tradition coming to an end upon your watch.